Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We're a little late coming to you this week, recording on a Monday night, and we will release tomorrow morning, Tuesday, September 26th. Our show this week, we wanted to mention that the MITRE Engenuity ATT&CK Evaluations announced the results of their enterprise cybersecurity solutions versus Turla emulations. And Turla is a known Russian-based threat group, and their tradecraft is platform diverse. Like, they have Linux as well as Windows attacks. They're dynamic and in stealth, and they layered in persistence. They leverage a lot of novel techniques and custom tooling, including the complex snake malware to elude defenses and persist on target networks. Now, these evaluations were open and fair, and they were paid for by each one of the vendors. So in order to participate, the vendors themselves would pay to participate in it. And it included a multitude of vendors, including like some well-known ones, obviously Bitdefender, Checkpoint, CrowdStrike, Microsoft, Palo Alto Networks, Rapid7, SentinelOne, Sophos, Trend Micro, so on and so forth. The whole list is up on the website, but obviously the big hitters were all there. And we like to mention anytime we're talking about Microsoft that Adam and I both work for the company in our security solutions field. So the attack evaluations, we'll post a link to it, but it's really good to kind of go and take a look at whatever your solution is to see how they did against the attacks. And the website does a really good job. You can pick the attack and the stage and the operating system, and it'll look at each one of the attacks and which stage it detected it in, whether it was like the first stage, second stage, third stage, so on and so forth. And you can even do side-by-side comparisons with other vendors if you're thinking about checking it out. So I know that each vendor kind of put out their own marketing material. Microsoft is not, excluded out of that. We definitely have a blog for how Microsoft did against the attacks, but it is always good to check the actual evaluations and walk through and see how your vendor did. And if you're looking at, how the other ones did, you can do a side-by-side comparison. As far as the categories, there were a few vendors that did really well. One category was 100% visibility across the attack, and there were 4 that were 100%. Microsoft, CyberReason, Cynet, and Palo Alto Networks. And then another category included technique level detections at every major step. There were 11 that had the techniques at every major step with 0 delay, and then there were 4 that had 100% but with some delay. Microsoft, Bitdefender, Checkpoint, CyberReason, Cynet, Fortinet, Harfang Labs, IBM Security, Malwarebytes, Palo Alto Networks, and Upticks were 11 of the ones that had it with 0 delay, and then Sophos, Trellix, Trend Micro, and CrowdStrike had 100% but with some delays. Some of these I haven't even heard, so they're probably a lot smaller vendors, which I think kind of speaks to the oversaturation, in my opinion, of just how many endpoint security solutions there are. And when people try to do like side-by-side comparisons, I always tell them, for the most part, all of these kind of do the same thing. So it really comes down to, what level of visibility and integration do you have with your other tools that you already use? Because we come out with these endpoint detection evaluations all the time. It's always good to kind of see how they do against real world. No one's going to be like 100% across the board at every single thing. Although, you can spin it that way. But if you go into the nitty gritty, there are going to be places that each one excels at one stage or one different attack. It just comes down to your holistic security as, when you're looking at it from a 50,000 foot level and how it integrates with your current tools and your visibility and how quickly you can respond. So again, I highly recommend that you go. Another thing in the web page with the report is that it shows you screenshots of the detection, the actual alert in each one of these vendors, and the level of detail between the vendors. There's a stark difference. Some of them just give you an alert with not much to go on, and others will give you a lot more detail to triage and to do investigation. So, it's a good comparison, especially if you're shopping around and kind of taking a look at what else is out there.
These MITRE evaluations are incredible. They're incredible tools for security defenders because they're so transparent in the findings and the results, and they don't do scoring. They don't do quadrants or waves. They just put the data out there and they let you make your own interpretation. So nobody gets a certain medal around their neck. Nobody gets in a certain quadrant. Nobody gets a certain designation. You go review the data for yourself. I will say there are some vendors whose reputation does not align with their performance in this. And you may experience some cognitive dissonance if you have really staked your flag in a certain camp. So I encourage you to go look at this. This is about as real world, as holistic, as unbiased as you will find. And there are haves and have-nots in this. And obviously, I think Microsoft did pretty well here. We work for Microsoft. We're pretty proud of this. We did post a blog post. There are other vendors that can be very proud of their performance as well. There are some vendors that I know I've had a lot of customers beat their chest about that didn't do so well. So this is a great public service. They've been doing this for many years now. I strongly recommend you go take a look at it and evaluate it for yourself. And like Andy said, the level of detail here is really unbelievable. And none of us have the budget, the time, or the resources to do this in the way MITRE does it. So not to say you shouldn't do a little bit of your own testing in your own environment, but this should be a significant data point in your decision making. And Andy, I like your point too. One of the takeaways you can really get from this is not to say like we have solved endpoint protection as an industry, because there's more work to be done. But I agree with you in the sense that there are several vendors that are kind of upper echelon here that deliver comparable performance. So then the question becomes, how do you layer that endpoint protection with the rest of your stack? Because as I often say on this show, taking our endpoint protection platform, dumping all those logs to a SIEM and using a SIEM as like a proactive hunting solution is maybe not the best experience. You really need an XDR platform, of which endpoint protection is one part of it. So I agree with you, Andy. You've got to look at how you're surrounding the endpoint with the other points of entry. We know, yes, the endpoint is critical. If we compromise the endpoint, that gives attackers that initial footing, but they're going to have to pivot to identity. They're going to have to gain privilege escalation. How did they get to the endpoint in the first place? Probably a malicious email or link. So those are all really, really important parts of your stack as well. And having that integrated and holistic so you can track and attack end to end is valuable as well. So overall, I think when you look at this, you're really proud of the progress we've made as an industry, because there's a lot of really strong performance here. But there's more work to be done. And delayed detections, when minutes matter, I think are a big, red flag here. You really want those detections as near real time as possible. So really cool stuff from MITRE. Great work from that team.
I think also when you look at endpoint protection solutions, there is more leeway when you are a smaller company. If you're a small business company or a startup and you have budget and you want to spend it on some boutique, whatever endpoint protection is here, that's probably fine. And it's going to deliver you pretty good results, right? But you're not going to get integration with a lot of other things. And you may not have other tools to integrate when you're a smaller company. You may not have a lot of SaaS apps. Maybe you don't have an identity platform, or maybe you don't have any other advanced things that are going on. So maybe just protect your endpoints and that's it. And that's good to go. As you grow and you get more attack surface and you have more security tools to integrate, then is when you have to look at, okay, an endpoint protection is not just the only thing I need. I need an XDR solution, like you said, Adam. And the other thing I found was really interesting. I don't know if this was in our blog, but the MITRE attack evaluation was actually conducted on Windows 10 operating systems. And because Microsoft's Defender for Endpoint is integrated with the operating system, had we used the straight up Windows 10 version that everyone else defaulted to, we would have been using an old EDR, whereas everyone else in this had up-to-date ones. And so one of the things that when we broke this down in one of our internal sessions, the project team that actually headed up this whole thing told us that they actually worked with the MITRE evaluations team to build in the newest version of Defender for Endpoint into an old version of Windows 10. So that was kind of cool. There was a lot of work that was actually done from Microsoft's end to actually compete and do this test, because natively Defender for Endpoint is integrated with Windows.
Right. I remember reading about that too, and I was at first perplexed on understanding what had happened, and you explained it really well. And I also thought was interesting is because we had to take that old version of Windows 10, essentially backport Defender for Endpoint to it so we could compete on level ground, that our agent was as updated as all the competitive agents. We also inadvertently or maybe intentionally fixed a CVE, which we had to intentionally reintroduce because the attack evaluation relied on attempting to hit that CVE. Was part of the script, I guess. So it was really interesting to read the whole process there, and obviously with MITRE's agreement to make it a fair battleground and not any sort of unfair advantage, but a significant amount of engineering effort involved. When in Microsoft's case, what's unique is that the operating system and the agent are one and the same. So you update the agent by updating the OS, and having to get the Windows engineering team together with the Defender for Endpoint team to essentially backport that so it could be used in this evaluation is pretty cool.
The next thing I wanted to talk about real quick is I follow Frank McGovern on X, or Twitter, the former Twitter, and he is the founder of Blue Team Con, which is a security conference focused on defenders that is headquartered in Chicago. It's a great conference if you have the chance to go. But he had a tweet that said, when assessing vendors, ask them what their employee satisfaction, average tenure, turnover rate, and diversity rates are. Just the questions start change. Selecting based on those answers will implement radical change, and as it does matter for risk regardless. So I thought that was super interesting, because I have been on the other side of the fence before as a customer and done vendor evaluations, and I have never thought about asking about their employee satisfaction. And I have seen at other vendors where, salespeople will bounce around and account teams will change over. And that happens at Microsoft too. But I think that asking the question is interesting, although getting a truthful answer may be harder, because maybe they'll just say, yeah, we're happy here, we're great. Although you can do your own research as far as turnover rates and diversity rates and average tenure. So that can be done. And I think that can tell you a story about, maybe how good the company is, their reputation, maybe even the quality of their products. Who knows, right?
When you first brought this up in the pre-show, I thought you were more talking about, like, I'm an information security professionally, a security defender, and I'm going to go work for this company. I should ask about these things like during the interview process, to understand the level of insider risk threat there as well, which I think is still a thing too, right? That's
Yes.
not what this is getting at. But they're very, very much related. I think those are interesting questions. And as you were bringing them up, Andy, I was putting my salesman hat on and thinking, I wonder how much of that I'm allowed to disclose, and like how much of that would be, I'd have to go through some sort of process to get approval to share that. I think overall, one thing Microsoft does, we were talking about this in the pre-show, Andy, as well, is like, we have a lot more leeway with social media policy. We're able to have our peers join us on this show, and nobody needs to go get permission, as long as you pretty much, the policy is don't do anything stupid. It's written out more than that, but that's essentially the policy. And other folks have, more steps to jump through. We've had folks from other employers be on our show, and they sometimes have more process. And anyhow, I get to that to say we tend to be more transparent on those things. We publish a lot of, like, our annual diversity report talks about the equality of pay, the equality of positions, and the breakdown of different ethnic groups who occupies different levels of leadership and all that. So we do publish a lot of that already. I would say some of, like, the internal, like, employee signals polls, I don't think we've ever really been very public about. They tend to leak fairly regularly, but that would be interesting for me to solve for if you had asked me. I think those are great questions to ask. And I think especially as you're selecting security vendors, having an understanding of that kind of state, the health of their employee base, is really, really important. And I agree. I think if that became kind of a standard part of, let's say, an RFP process, if every time you issue an RFP, you ask those questions, and that became standard across the industry, that would force a lot more organizations to be outright with them, very upfront with them. Today, companies on RFPs will ask questions like, where are you based? How long have you been in business? How many employees do you have? What's your average spend in R&D? Things like that are relatively benign. Like, they're trying to understand, like, are you big enough to support me? Especially if you're talking to, like, boutique vendors, you want to understand how big they are. It always seems kind of silly when you're Microsoft. It's like, how many employees do you have? 300,000, how much do you spend at security R&D? Wow, $4 billion a year. Like, I'm pretty sure our answers are going to be sufficient, but if it was a boutique company responding to those RFPs, it's a wildly different experience, and you can glean a lot of information from that. And so I think these would be understandable additional questions to ask. So I like this concept here, and I absolutely agree this maps to level of insider risk. I think when we've talked about insider risk on this show in the past, we have certainly touched on employee satisfaction as a risk factor there, and looking for folks who are on performance improvement plans, or who are given their 2 weeks, or other factors like that potentially bring more risk to the table.
Yep. Yeah, I like the call out on the RFP. I don't fill out too many of those. I know you definitely get a lot more of the RFPs, but yeah, imagine if those were questions on an RFP. I think that would force vendors to start thinking about, hey, we probably need to invest more in our employee satisfaction. And so, speaking of insider risk, I found an article that talked about, how insider risk is increasing in cost for companies. The report from this article on CISO Online says that companies are generally underfunding their employee and their insider risk programs, and that the total cost of an insider risk attack or breach rose from $15.4 million in 2022 to $16.2 million in 2023. And I found that it was really interesting. They categorized the three levels or categories of insider threat. The first one is threats that arose because of malicious insiders looking to harm the companies, like disgruntled employees. Just like we talked about here, employee satisfaction makes a big difference. The second one is more of a social engineering. So threats that arose from an outside attacker outsmarting a vulnerable employee who was taken in by a phishing scam or something similar. So that we just had an example of at an MGM resorts, right? And then the final one is they're saying it's the most costly category. The report describes negligent or mistaken insiders who ignored warnings from security systems or misconfigured systems. So inadvertently causing some sort of attack because you either missed a warning sign or you have a misconfigured system. And so based on the numbers, they said more than half, 55% of the money spent on insider incident response went towards problems caused by negligence or mistakes, compared to just 20% were the novel attacks that were just simply outsmarting business staff or IT, and 25% were caused by actively malicious insiders. I think for me, 25% is still a lot. Like for employee dissatisfaction that I have to worry about. 55% coming from negligence or mistakes. I mean, that's going to happen, I think. Misconfigured systems happen all the time. That's why you do penetration testing, vulnerability management, and humans will make mistakes. But for me, the social engineering from the 20% and the actively malicious of the other 25 or 45% of the combined attacks there, that is still a big concern for me. So in the final estimate, they said another thing that I found interesting was that 10% of insider risk management budgets were spent on pre-incident outlays, which was roughly $64,000 per incident. The remaining $565,000 roughly per incident went towards containment, remediation, investigation, incident response, and escalation. So you can see that we're definitely underfunding, and we're not really funding the defenses and the programs. We're spending all the money on the tail end, which is after the incident happens. So I think this was a little bit eye-opening for me when I read through it. I think insider risk is a huge problem that most people, it's really hard in security to detect the things that people have granted access to, right? That's one of the hardest things to do. It's easy to block access or see malicious access in general, but the person who has access and doing malicious things with that access that you've already granted that access for, I think that is one of the hardest things in security to solve for.
I will say from our perspective, from the portion of the world that we get to see, Andy, Microsoft sells an insider risk management solution. I'm not aware of a single one of my customers that I've had, and I've probably had, let's say 65 customers assigned to me over the last, 27 months. So about, 2 years and 3 months. I'm not aware of a single one of those 65 that have deployed an insider risk management solution end to end, that have seriously said, we are going after this full throttle. Now, to be fair, I would say almost all of my customers had major immaturities in other areas. And so this didn't rise to the level of prioritization yet to get on it. Many of them, if not all of them, acknowledge this as a threat. They see that it's a game of prioritization. I think we had a show recently about data security, and we talked about customers have been saying we want to do that forever, and it's never bubbled up the priority list enough to get done. This is the new data security, which, by the way, it actually goes hand in hand with data security. But I just don't know if companies just don't have the maturity to focus on this yet. And probably rightfully so. I'd have a hard time naming a customer that I would say is so buttoned up and has such a good handle on things that this is where they should be spending their time. It's a huge risk. And I think almost everyone sees that. It's just yet another piece of kindling on the fire. When do you want me to get to that? I've got a million other things burning right now too. And so I see that as the challenge. It's not to say you just need to, go deploy a tool and you've solved insider risk. I'm not saying that, but certainly it's a good first step. And as you point out, Andy, existing tooling is really poorly designed to catch this. So you do need, in many cases, bespoke tooling for it because it's looking for very, very different things than you're traditionally accustomed to looking for. And so that's only fair that when the targets and the goals and the signals are radically different, you need a radically different tool as well. And so it remains a tough challenge. It's a challenge of priorities. It's a challenge of either owning the tooling or having time to implement and deploy the tooling. And it's the fact that in a lot of cases, insider risk is not purely the domain of information security. You have significant crossover into human resources, whoever does internal investigations or audit, as well as, yes, there's an InfoSec portion of it, but it is not all them. And so I think that's the other hard part, is this requires multiple disciplines, multiple stakeholders, if you will, to all come together to help do something like this. And it's hard. And yeah, that totally tracks. Everything you shared tracks. I'd say the only thing interesting about this report to me is like the breakdown of, you have like a difference between being outsmarted versus like mistaken insiders. Like, to me, those are kind of the same thing. I guess one is purely ignorance. One could be more, I guess they were classifying as negligence, but they kind of give a little wiggle room there. So hard to say for sure, but definitely something like, hey, dear listener, if you think you've got it all buttoned up, then this is the next place to go for sure. And I think we will continue to talk about insider risk and best ways to mitigate that moving forward, because it remains an ongoing and growing threat for all of our listeners and basically almost everyone.
Yeah. I think it's also very important that technical tooling is only a part of insider risk programs. And if you don't have the money to go and buy that, you can start just by figuring out how big your risk might be, which is, Adam mentioned our employee signals survey. That tells leadership how happy people are at the company at this point in time. And you have the chance to put down your comments. And if your pay sucks, you can say, I'm not compensated enough for my job, and leadership should, and they do at our company, read the signals report and they try to make adjustments based on that. And so I think working with HR to figure out what your risk might be just for insider risk on disgruntled employees, I mean, that's 25% of the risk right there, right? And so it doesn't cost any money to send out a survey every month and just figure out how big your risk might be from an employee satisfaction. And that's one place to start. So you don't have to go out and spend money on a tool, which you can, but you can start by just building a program and, trying to build employee satisfaction, train your employees better, do pen testing, vulnerability management to see if you have any misconfigurations. So you can start there, start small, and doesn't always have to be technical tooling.
Good call there. You got to quantify it first before you can even go ask for funding anyway. Mm-hmm. Usually companies don't throw money away for no reason. They want to know, what risk am I specifically addressing? So those are good first steps regardless. If you're going to be able to buy a tool or not, you would need to do that work either way. So start to quantify the risk, start to wrap your arms around how big the problem is. And there are certainly non-tooling things you can do to reduce your risk as well, as far as privileged identity management, removing admin access from your endpoints. I mean, that we could do a whole show on ways to help reduce insider risk without buying an insider risk tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.